In 2009, two gentlemen played what may forever stand as the greatest game of Warhammer 40,000 ever. Only a single photograph endures to bear witness to this historic moment. Although it is blurry, you can still make out one player crouching next to an evenly spaced line of 26 Kroot warriors, while his opponent and a judge search in vain for a ruling that deep down everyone knows isn't going to save them. At the risk of sounding like the old man from Pixar's Up, wargamers today don't know how good they have it. Spoiled with balanced data slates delivering core rules changes, points updates for every single unit in the game every 3 months, and multiple sites keeping track of tens of thousands of games played. Warhammer 40,000 is now as balanced as it ever has been, and considering what we're dealing with here, as balanced as it's ever likely to get. Long-term players of this game have seen some terrifying sights on their gaming tables, from leafblower armies built to remove all of the opponent's models in a couple of turns, through to self-propagating virus weaponry wiping out whole armies in a single attack, to demonic gifts that allowed players to just move their opponent's models around the board. And now all of these boogeymen are about to escape from the cupboard as we take a terrifying trip down memory lane. Let's talk about everything that broke 40k since its very beginning. The first edition of Warhammer 40,000 was known as Rogue Trader, and it's actually going to be the hardest on this list to talk about because it's both really easy to break and really hard. This is because the rules were incredibly woolly and vague, but solved that issue by encouraging players to use a third-party games master to smooth out any issues during play. Also, army lists were semi-random, and sometimes you just wouldn't have certain units available to you. However, it's hard not to read the rules for following fire and pack your army full of weapons with that ability to guarantee a win. Following fire is a special ability that represented weapons that got multiple shots, like for example, a heavy bolter. But rather than stating that a heavy bolter had 3 shots a turn, if your weapon had following fire, you continued to roll to hit and wound until you failed to roll to wound. So weapons like heavy plasma guns could use following fire on low power to keep rolling strength 7 hits against models within 4 inches of the first. And if all that failed, you could simply rely on some off-table vortex missile support. Ultimately, during this time it was a pre-internet era. There were few if any tournaments and no one wrote any of this down. But this would all change in 1993 because out came 2nd edition. In this edition, games started to get more formalised, with army creation standardised and no need for a third party to act as an umpire mid-game. A player wishing to abuse the rules had a banquet of options in just the war gear cards alone. Why not obliterate your opponent's entire army with a virus grenade that just kept spreading endlessly as it killed models? Individual characters could be pumped to the gills with combat drugs, and if you didn't want to face them, just use Hrolf's Hood of Darkness to turn your leader invisible. Assassins could replace opponents' models with polymorphine and then jump out to deliver the killing blow in combat, or with the famous instant death vortex grenade. Meanwhile, regular units produced devastating enough effects by themselves. Orc pulsar rockets could cause entire sections of the opposing army to be completely paralysed. Meanwhile, the only thing ever fixed via balance patch was the removal of the virus outbreak strategy card that could be randomly dealt to players at the start of the game. If you want to know what the most powerful army was, I would make a decent case for the Elder Army in White Dwarf 196. This battle report pitted the winner of that year's Warhammer 40,000 Players Tournament against the winner of that year's Warhammer 40,000 Staff Tournament, and the army that would emerge as victorious actually looked quite plain by today's standards, except it wasn't at all. A load of small, cheap, minimally armed Guardian units functioned as a screen for 3 Elder support weapon platforms, 2 of which had scatter lasers, which were incredibly reliable multi-shot infantry killers. But the critical part was the single distort cannon, its party trick of instantly killing anything its 2-inch template was positioned over 66% of the time, and usually crippling anything else by distorting it somewhere else on the battlefield, was typically balanced by it being inaccurate, unless a Farseer cast a psychic power guide on it. You see, this wasn't the modern day version of Guide which just provided rerolls. This was the original recipe full fat artificial colours that will mess with your kids' lives guide. This meant that the weapon could fire again a second time this turn, except this time it doubled its range and also hit automatically. Effectively, this meant it hard countered any armoured vehicles on the other side of the board. Meanwhile, the combat in this army was handled by the Elder Phoenix Lord Janzar, who in this edition was the single most powerful unit for their points in the entire game, able to simply paralyse and kill almost anything that wandered into her 18-inch charge range. Even the winner's opponent, another tournament winner, couldn't overcome this onslaught with an Elder army with first turn advantage and a strategy card that allowed them to literally bring a unit back from the dead. So it's score 1 for the Elder and bring on the next edition. Also score 1 for my Ko-fi subscribers. The gold tier members get their name and a unique icon added to my special Hall of Fame in the style of units from this great golden era. Hopefully I can get enough people signed up to turn off the adverts, and then you can enjoy these videos with no interruptions. But talking of interruptions, let's bring on 3rd edition. 3rd edition Warhammer 40,000 was an effort to massively simplify and condense the last decade of the game into something a normal person could actually play. The rulebook contained all the points and rules for every unit in the game at that point, because all previous codexes had been invalidated. And as will become a theme in this video, this would make it incredibly popular with its players. Unfortunately, as will also become a theme, it was just a little bit broken. The new all-plastic multi-part Space Marine kit had just been released, and the designers had tweaked them to be pretty points efficient, especially paired with a popular strategy at that time known as Rhino Rush. Essentially, take a bunch of Marines, stick them in rhinos, and just throw them forward. Very few extremely strong close combat units existed, so those Marines could be relied on to pull their weight even against units like Orc mobs and small Tyrannid swarms. Meanwhile, the Rhinos could move and still allow the Marines inside to disembark and charge. This gave them a huge threat range of 20 inches. To make matters worse, if you wiped out a unit in combat, you could then perform a sweeping advance, moving an additional 2d6 inches and into combat with enemy units who would be unable to move or shoot in response. And to make things even worse, in the case of designers clearly pushing the envelope too far, Blood Angel's Rhinos had overcharged engines where they would move an extra 6 inches on a roll of 2 or more. And Blood Angels got an extra point of initiative on the charge, meaning that they were mostly striking first, and Blood Angels also got an extra point of strength on the charge, meaning that they could easily take out a tank in combat by attacking its rear armour, and Blood Angel Death Company had an additional 4+ feel no pain save. And the Death Company unit got larger before the game as some of the Blood Angel's army succumbed to the Black Rage and got added into it, potentially allowing the whole army to start the game in one massive unit. The winner of 1999's Grand Tournament looked like this. A fully stocked Rhino to tie units up on turn 1, and a bunch of jump pack troops ready to jump in on turn 2. Luckily, the following year out came Codex Craftweld Elder, which gave the already strong Elder army access to Seer Councils, units of Farseers and Warlocks who had re-rollable invulnerable saves and could be supplied with literally infinite Warlocks. This, backed up with Wraithlords, a cheap monstrous creature immune to anything below strength 5, plus cheap 5-man Black Guardian units with star cannons and units of War Walkers to eliminate enemies from range, would reign supreme for a small while. In 2002, Chaos got a second codex of the edition, which allowed a Chaos player to take an Iron Warriors army, which traded 2 fast attack slots for a heavy support slot. You then filled these 4 slots with multiple units of Obliterators, a unit that could pick one of many weapons to manifest each turn, as well as Vindicators or Basilisks or Defilers that could shoot indirectly. I'm going to call this edition a tie between Elder and Chaos, but just you wait, because along came 4th edition. In the case of the designers being too late to the party, 4th edition officially fixed the rules on combats and transport vehicles. Only Land Raiders and open top vehicles let their squads disembark into combat, and you could no longer just sweeping advance an opposing army away. So the idea became move forward, get out, and shoot. Eldar were particularly good at this, having falcons and wave serpents. Tau were inadvertently the masters of this strategy. The tactic known as Fish of Fury meant that due to the size of Tau vehicles, units could disembark from their devilfishes, fire, and then be out of range of the opposing unit charging them in combat the following turn. Necrons were alright if you took a bunch of destroyers, although they suffered against armies that could bring units with a 2+ armor save to the table. Space Marine Terminators were briefly able to take 2 assault cannons per unit. The assault cannons had the rending ability to ignore toughness and armor saves. But this didn't bother the Eldar and Chaos players, who were still shooting things dead from range. This was the first edition where codexes weren't invalidated as before. The new Eldar Codex in 2006 took away a lot of their toys, like Black Guardians. Iron Warriors players braced themselves for their turn to be nerfed, and instead they ended up getting new toys. When Codex Chaos Space Marines was released in 2007, they lost the extra heavy support slot but gained the ability to take a pair of Slaanesh Demon Princes with the power Lash of Submission. This incredible power could be used to move enemy units 2d6 inches each in the psychic phase, either off of objectives before they were scored or into the range of the flying demon princes themselves, who weren't slouches in combat either. But the pain didn't stop there, because along in 2008 came 5th edition. As was becoming clear, Games Workshop's strategy of changing the core rules of the game but keeping the codexes the same was causing problems. Because at the same time as the rules were being tightened up, people were finding loopholes and exploiting them en masse thanks to a vast amount of activity on web forums. And without balance patches or regular FAQs, things as inconsequential as how you allocated wounds in a unit caused massive issues. Basically, the wound allocation system of this time meant that you could take units that contained models with unique wargear combinations and separate the damage over the entire unit rather than kill off the models in order. So if you had 10 uniquely armed models and they each had 2 wounds, you could split the incoming fire so that each model took 1 wound and therefore no one would die until the unit took its 11th wound. Once again, trying to find a competitively balanced scenario in the rulebook was impossible, either having an instant win objective game or the hated kill points, where each unit, no matter how large or small, counted for 1 point. So ideally you wanted an army with a large, fast, multi-wound, multi-loadout unit. Luckily, Orcs had one already. Orc Knob Bikers, who were very fast and absolutely abused these rules to the maximum. Combat suddenly started to dominate again, like in 2nd and 3rd edition. However, very quickly the 5th edition Imperial Guard Codex came out, and suddenly message boards were flooded with an unexpected event. People started talking about garden maintenance equipment. A good old leafblower army. Do you reckon I could put this on the tractor turn? And also they have a hedge trimmer army as well, which was really good of them. Good old Warhammer teaching me how to exploit loopholes. The leafblower was a specific build of mechanized Imperial Guard. You took 5 Chimeras, then filled them with Imperial Guard squads and had their heavy weapons firing out the roof. You then put them in a line and used them to block line of sight to 5 assorted indirectly firing artillery pieces directly behind them. Then take a couple of flying Valkyries that could drop off veteran teams with special weapons and demo charges, add in some specialists to disrupt enemy reserves and auto-fire at any deep striking units, and literally blow most armies off the board. At least in 2011, players could use the Grey Knights Codex, which introduced Drago and his multi-wound Grey Knight Paladins, backed up with dreadnoughts with dual twin autocannons and Cybolt ammo to hopefully chew through some of this stuff. At this time, an honourable mention has to go to the Kroot Conga Line photo taken at the 2009 European Team Championship tournament in Germany. The story behind it is that the Tau player deployed first and declared his Kroot squad was infiltrating. At this time, a player could put their entire army in reserve, so the White Scars player took this option to allow him to essentially redeploy on turn 1 when he moved in from his board edge. However, he never got the chance, as the rules on infiltrate meant the Kroot could be placed anywhere on the battlefield as long as there was no enemy within 12 inches. They formed a single line on the opponent's table edge. The White Scars player had no flying units and couldn't move normal units within an inch of the Kroot, so never deployed his army, leading to an instant win for the Tau player and one epic photo opportunity. It sounds evil, and yet I'd still prefer to play this game than any we are about to come across, because 6th edition 40k got even worse. Now the problems really started. Up to now, none of the editions had been perfect at any point. You could sum them up by saying each of them was 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But in their defense, at least the most broken army in the previous editions looked like an army a normal person would naturally have in their collection. 6th edition introduced allies via the dreaded and derided Allies Matrix. Taudar was a thing. You take the best Tau shooting units, Pathfinders and Riptides, and combine them with the best Elder Psykers and fast and powerful and cheap Elder Jetbikes to score objectives. In fact, the theme of armies being able to take allies started a near decade-long series of players cherry-picking the best part of 2 or more separate codexes to build a list. Aircraft, a previously rare Forge World only unit, were now made in plastic and given powerful rules out of the bat. If you had one of the new codexes like Necrons, you got both powerful flyers and powerful anti-flyer weaponry, and if you didn't, you were pretty much stuck. This immediately spawned the Necron Flying Circus. You take some Immortals, you put them in a Night Scythe as a dedicated transport, and then you do that 6 more times. They were cheap, efficient, and you could also use their huge base size to simply block out areas of the battlefield. And even if your opponent downed one of these Night Scythes, the squad inside would be safe and placed in reserve, ready to re-enter the battlefield when ready. In interviews since, Rick Priestley mentioned that this is the time that the sales team started to influence the game's design, which is why we suddenly had competitive lists with sometimes 6 or more of the same models appearing in them. Which was fine as long as you bought and painted 4, 5 or 6 of the exact same units. Also, remember that weird point in time when even terrain was powerful? The Aegis defense line, the original one at least, became an almost auto take for Imperial armies, as it allowed you to give your entire army cover at the start of the game. The original model even gave you a free quad autocannon that could be crewed by someone in your army. The rules totally broke down as the rulebook's random mission structure had been supplanted by the fan-built Nova open tournament structure, which turned competitive 40k into a much more formalised experience, but it also meant that Games Workshop were balancing their armies on the rulebook missions, while the tournament community was playing a completely different game. To make it even worse, the core rules were pretty poorly written. The rules on terrain were 20 pages long, which, after only a couple of years, led to 7th edition. 7th was rushed out very quickly, so it looked very similar to the previous edition, and unfortunately, it managed to make things even worse. The quicker turnaround might have made the rules more solid, but it led to another round of codex refreshes, which were churned out like there was no tomorrow. If you remember that problem of codexes lasting a huge length of time before being replaced, well, grabbing a hold on this new-fangled internet thing, Games Workshop quickly leaned into the idea that they could publish ebooks and skip the normal publishing costs of physical codexes. This, mixed in with specialist formations in certain box sets, led to a massive issue with rules bloat. Death Stars were a thing. You basically took a bunch of characters and then added them all into one unit so they could all hide behind the ablative wounds of that unit. This was made even worse by the fact that allies still existed. You could cherry pick the best characters from every single Space Marine codex and stick them all together, usually in a Ravenwind bike unit for added mobility, and allow them to chain their special abilities together. 7th edition 40k also added super heavy vehicles into the main rules as their curiously named D-weapons that would bypass most armor saves and caused instant death to anything the template landed on. Knights came out, and as you would expect from being a large, high-ticket army, were extremely tough to bring down. But worse were the rules for formations. Basically, if you built a list to a specific theme, you got an inbuilt bonus. If you took the Space Marine Gladius Strike Force formation, you could take 5 or 10 units of Marines, and as a bonus, you got free transports for all of them. That took your 2,000 point tournament army and added 700 points worth of extra equipment in it in the form of 10 free Razorbacks, most likely all armed with dual assault cannons. I mean, you could do that assuming you were nuts enough to risk buying all of these extra models in the face of a sea of changing rules. By the time it was over, 7th edition had around 50 supplements. The good news was that they were in a digital format, so you didn't have to carry them all around with you. The bad news was that 50 supplements was 49 supplements too many. Luckily, around the corner was 8th edition, as well as a brand new CEO. The massive impact of 8th edition was like a wave of clean water washing away the stale bedsheets of the previous mess. It had all new, tighter and simplified rules, offered up with new army lists for every army on day one. The experience was so full on, most players were unable to really confirm how powerful everything was because the game was just so different to anything that had come before. Stratagems added an interesting twist as they added an element of player skill that meant players couldn't easily copy an army from the internet and expect to use it to simply wipe the floor with their opponents quite as easily as they could before. Naturally, there was a bedding in period where armies going first had a 60% win rate in tournaments until those players learnt the value of reserves and skirmishing screens to prevent the now much faster gameplay from leading to a turn 1 alpha strike by the first player. An early attempt by a few players to take 9 Imperial Guard Hellhounds in one list quickly led to Games Workshop countering with a core rules change that is in place to this day that limited each unit to only be taken 3 times. In fact, the quick reactions of the design team kept otherwise oppressive units that were overpowered on release, like the Primaris Executioner and Knight Castellan, fixed with free rules updates. You would expect new units to be overpowered, but this wasn't always the case. The first round of Primaris Marines were extremely weak, and players had to wait years before the Iron Hands and Raven Guard Codex supplements pushed them into the top tier before being quickly nerfed. Tournament support was taken seriously, with factions balanced to within around 20% win rates. But inevitably, some issues started to appear. The Resin Forge World units had their own rules and weren't balanced at all like the regular game was, some of which went on reigns of terror over the edition and supplanted the more normal units in their armies' lists. The biggest issue was with the allies system. Allies were still a thing, but the designers tried to make them harder to abuse. Eventually, Imperial players found the most efficient way to take them, which was the Loyal 32, i.e. a battalion of 2 company commanders and 3 10-man Imperial Guardsmen units. This was the cheapest way to generate 5 command points and only cost 186 points. Its very existence meant that all Imperial armies were balanced around people taking them to boost their command points. In fact, why not take the Loyal 32, a Castellan Knight, and 3 Blood Angels commanders with jump packs, Thunderhammers, and Storm Shields? Even after a series of nerfs, it was still an overbearing force on the tabletop, or at least it was, until a couple of years later. 9th edition was another attempt to fix issues in the game by changing the main rules but leaving the codexes intact. It was mainly a series of tweaks to the 8th edition rule set, with allies no longer providing the benefits to command points and a few other bits. I'm not sure if you've heard or not, but there was a big pandemic during its release that prevented people actually playing it in person. However, by the time people did, it became clear that it was a mixed bag. On one hand, armies started to look like single armies again rather than patchwork quilts. On the other hand, it was clear that the stratagem system had got out of hand. More specifically, each army having access to 5 pages of stratagems that they could gotcha each other with during casual games. And with around 20 armies in the game, that's 100 total pages of rules to remember. The stratagem system started off as a kind of quaint bonus that allowed you to do small effects like turn a heavy bolter into a weapon that did D3 mortal wounds on a 2 or more, which was nice but hardly broken. Unfortunately, as the game progressed, newer codexes got better and better stratagems that allowed units to duplicate their actions, like firing or attacking in combat twice. In fact, it wasn't the armies that actually broke the game, it was new players being gotcha'd mid-game by a surprise stratagem, allowing a unit to attack after death or move to a completely different location. At least the armies themselves were almost balanced. Almost. Due to the quantity of releases and the newer armies being playtested against each other, it led to Elder and Tyranid codexes being playtested against the newer Leagues of Votann codex, and the totally new Votann army being moved up in power to counter them. This led to the Votann army being so powerful on release that Games Workshop made a video about it and promised a balance patch before the rules were fully released. The combo was nerfed with a balanced data slate, and the addition just kind of settled in. Armies that could field large amounts of powerful indirect fire units like Space Marines, Elder, and Death Guard moved to the top of the rankings by just shooting units that were trying to capture objectives to death. Websites like StatCheck and Goonhammer broke down all tournament scores in a publicly available space, and we appeared to hit a post-balanced state. One or two armies poking over the 60% win threshold was just news that they were going to get nerfs focusing on key units in the winning lists in a few months' time. But the 3-year release cycle demanded another edition. It was time for a change. 10th edition came out in the same style as 8th, with an entire rule set, simplified rules, and easier to read datasheets that reduced the amount of complexity around weapons and added unique abilities to each unit. Each army had free PDF rules available on day one. Sadly, even by giving away free rules to everyone, Games Workshop could not catch a break. Issues with fixed squad sizes and all units costing the same regardless of different wargear loadouts chafed some people. However, the big issue was that players had got a lot more active when they're gaming. The miniature wargaming community had rapidly adjusted to use Tabletop Simulator on Steam over the course of the pandemic, and were now able to put their collective hive mind brain into working out what the top armies were within around 48 hours of the rules dropping. Death Guard and Adeptus Mechanicus were on the bottom end, and you'll never guess who was right at the top: the Elder once again. Specifically the Elder Wraith Knight combined with their special Fate Dice ability. Essentially, an Elder player got a special store of dice that they could roll in advance of the game and then spend to replace other dice they rolled throughout the course of the game. In the shooting phase, a player could fire a Wraith Knight's twin heavy Wraith cannons and use a Fate Dice instead of rolling to wound to trigger its devastating wound ability, and therefore dish out 2d6 unsavable mortal wounds. From then, it got even worse, because on your opponent's movement phase, you could declare Overwatch using its towering ability to see over most cover and a Fate Dice to substitute a 6 to automatically hit, starting the entire cycle again and ruining most enemy armies before turn 2. People threw tantrums online for the 3 months this combo existed, and all I could do was sit back and laugh because I knew of everything that had come before. The cold hard fact is that once you build a set of miniature wargaming rules and expose it to thousands and thousands of players, many of whom play it multiple times a week and many of whom play it professionally on YouTube, the dominant strategy will get worked out very quickly. The moment the book is sent out to influencers, someone somewhere is now financially obligated to find the most powerful stuff in it. This manifested the same way it always does, with a small amount of people making a huge amount of noise about the rules being broken and the whole edition being junk, and a much larger amount of people buying loads more models and just waiting 3 months for the inevitable round of nerfs. In conclusion, everything will eventually change, so buy what you like, paint what you like, please subscribe, click this video for more, and I'll see you next time.